You do not remember the moment it began. That is the first thing I want you to understand. There was no single morning, no event you could point to and say that is where I stopped being allowed to want. It happened earlier than memory, earlier than language. It happened in the body. You recognize this, the tightening just below the sternum when someone asks something of you, not fear exactly, not reluctance, something older than both, a reflex so deep it does not feel like a choice. Feels like breathing. It feels like the only reasonable response to being alive in a room with another person who has a need. That is not generosity. I want to be precise about that from the beginning. What you have been calling generosity is something else entirely. It is a behavioral structure erected by a child who discovered very early that her own wanting was dangerous. Not dangerous in the way of tigers or fire, dangerous in a quieter, more durable sense. Dangerous because it produced a particular look on someone's face, a withdrawal of warmth, a cooling in the room, and the child, as children always do, learned. She learned what kept the room warm. She learned to put her own hunger down before it was seen, not to suppress it. Exactly, suppression still knows what it suppresses. She learned to genuinely not notice it, to experience her own wanting as something foreign, something that did not quite belong to her, something that, when it surfaced, must have come from a defect she had not yet corrected. I have called this, in my work on the development of personality, the sacrifice of the self at the altar of adaptation. I did not mean it as metaphor. I meant it as clinical description. The child does not lose herself all at once. She loses herself in increments. Each increment purchased with a small relief, the warmth that returns, the approval that settles back into the room like heat after a draft has passed. She does not know she is paying. That is the cruelty of it. She experiences each payment as virtue, as her best self, as proof that she is good, and she is surrounded always by people who confirm this, who say how thoughtful you are, how giving, how patient, how rare, and she believes them because believing them costs nothing. Doubting them would cost everything. This is the loop, not a loop she entered freely, a loop she was shaped into before she was old enough to know what shaping meant. Now, I want you to sit with what I am about to say, because it will feel wrong before it feels true. The selflessness was not love. It was fear wearing love's face so successfully that even she could not tell them apart. I do not say this to diminish what she gave. She gave enormously. She kept rooms warm that would have gone cold. She absorbed impacts that would have shattered others. She held configurations of relationship together through sheer psychic labor that no one named, because the moment you name it, you must also ask, who is paying? No one asked, and she did not ask either. Because asking would have meant acknowledging that she was owed something, and being owed something meant she had wants, and wants meant the body remembers what the mind has agreed to forget. That tightening below the sternum, you recognize this. It is not anxiety. It is a very old recording in my work with patients, and I must speak plainly here as I always have. I saw again and again a particular configuration in those who had been designated the feeling bearers of their families, the ones who sensed the temperature of the room before they entered it, who adjusted themselves to what the room required before anyone spoke, who experienced other people's emotional states not as information about the other person, but as instructions for what to do next. These were not weak people. I want to be emphatic on this point because it is where so many analyses go wrong. These were individuals of extraordinary psychic sensitivity and structural intelligence. They had developed a perceptual apparatus of unusual precision, the ability to read micro-shifts in tone, posture, a Ceylonese, the weight of a pause. They could do this because they had to, because the cost of misreading was high, and because they had been doing it since before they could walk steadily. What they could not do, or rather what they had never been permitted to practice, was something so elementary that its absence is almost invisible until you name it. They did not know what they wanted when nothing was required of them. Put them in a room alone with no task, no one to attend to, no temperature to manage, and there is a strange blankness. Not emptiness, not peace, a kind of suspended state. Like an instrument tuned so precisely to another's frequency that in silence it produces nothing. I once wrote, in essence, that the persona, the face we shape for the world, when it is forced into being too early and too completely, does not merely cover the self, it replaces it. The child does not learn that she is the caring one. She becomes the caring one at a cellular level, at the level where identity is stored, and this is where the damage is deepest. Not in what was taken from her, but in what she never developed at all. She never developed a relationship to her own desire. Not desire in the narrow sense. I mean the full registered desire for solitude without guilt, desire for refusal without collapse, desire to disappoint someone and remain standing, desire to take up space in a room without immediately calculating whether her presence has made anyone uncomfortable. These are not luxuries. They are the structural elements of a self. Without them, what exists is capable, perceptive, even brilliant, but organized entirely around a center that is located in someone else. This is not a disorder. I want to be careful here, this is an adaptation. A supremely successful adaptation to an environment that required it. The problem is not that the adaptation failed. The problem is that it succeeded so completely that it persisted long after the environment changed, long after the child became an adult, long after the room that required constant temperature management was left behind. The body did not leave it behind. That is the paradox. The body remained in that room, continued taking its readings, continued adjusting in new rooms with new people in entirely different configurations. The body kept the old contract. Music, kept watching the faces, kept tucking the want down before it surfaced, kept finding its orientation not in itself, but in the nearest person who had a need. I have seen this in patients I treated for decades. Successful people, often people admired for their steadiness, their generosity, their emotional intelligence, who came to me not because they were failing, but because something had begun to go wrong in the mechanism. A fatigue had set in that no amount of rest addressed. A vague wrongness they could not name, a sense that they had been living someone else's life with extraordinary competence. They did not know it was a child's life they were living, the life of the child who learned, before she could articulate learning, that her survival depended on not being selfish. And here I must define selfish as the child defined it, because the definition matters. Selfish to that child meant having a preference that conflicted with someone else's, having a need that required another person to redirect their attention, saying no, feeling tired in a way that asked for accommodation, being unhappy in a way that inconvenienced someone, wanting something for herself without a justification that placed it in service of others. Any of these things in the original environment produced the consequence, the cooling, the withdrawal, the look. So, the definition of selfish became enormous. It expanded until it encompassed almost everything that constitutes a self, and she reduced herself to what remained, which was the giving, the adjusting, the sensing, the holding, and she was by every external measure very good at it. There is a dream I encountered more than once in different forms among patients of this type. A child standing at the long table setting plates, setting them carefully correctly for everyone present. And when the table is set and the people are seated, there is no chair. Not because one was forgotten, because it never occurred to anyone, including the child herself, that she would be sitting down. She is still standing when the dream ends. Music, I do not interpret that dream for you. You already know what it means. You have been standing at that table for longer than you can calculate. The question this lecture will not answer with hope or instruction, because that is not what is needed. Here is a different one. Not how do you sit down, but what happened inside you when you finally understood that there had never been a chair. That understanding is not a wound. It is a completion, and what completes does not always feel like liberation. Sometimes often it feels like a very quiet, very cold kind of knowledge settling into the place where the adaptation used to live. That settling has already begun in you. That is why you are here. There is a particular moment, and I want you to locate it. Not remember it. Because remembering implies distance. And this has no distance. There is a particular moment when the loop becomes visible to you for the first time. Not as insight, not as revelation. Those words carry too much light. It is more like standing in a room you have lived in for 30 years and suddenly seeing that one of the walls is made of something other than what you believed. The furniture is the same. The light is the same. You are the same, but the wall is different. And once you have seen it, the room is permanently altered even though nothing has moved. That is what happens when the child's contract becomes visible to the adult. And I want to examine that moment carefully because it is where the behavior loop reveals its architecture. You did not notice the loop while you were inside it. This is not a failure of intelligence. I will say that plainly. Because there is a tendency when people first understand what has been operating in them to collapse into self-accusation, to ask, how did I not see this? How did I consent to this for so long? But consent is the wrong word entirely. You cannot consent to what you cannot perceive. And the loop by its nature made itself imperceptible. It did this not through deception. There was no external agent constructing it to trap you, but through something more subtle and more durable. It made itself feel like you. The giving felt like your nature. The attending felt like your instinct. The self-erasure felt like consideration. The suppression of want felt like wisdom. Every element of the adaptation wore your face so completely that there was no gap through which a different interpretation could enter. This is what I mean when I say the adaptation succeeded. It succeeded in becoming invisible. And the invisibility was not incidental. It was structural because a child who could see the mechanism would also be able to question it. And a child who questions the mechanism risks the cooling, the withdrawal, the look. So, the mechanism hid itself inside virtue, inside goodness, inside the most admired qualities the culture knows how to name. I have observed this pattern, and I use the word observed deliberately. Because this is not theory in patients who had been functioning for decades under the conviction that their caregiving was chosen. That it arose from a genuine abundance within them. That it was in the most literal sense who they were, and it was who they were. That is the difficult truth. Not because they were born that way, but because they were shaped that way early enough that the shaping preceded the self. They did not develop a self and then choose to be giving. The giving developed first as a survival strategy, and the self formed around it the way a tree forms around a fence post driven into its center. The tree grows. The tree is real. The tree produces leaves and shade and all the things a tree produces. But there is something at the center that was never would. Now the loop, the behavioral loop that governs the empath. And here I will use that word not as category of special persons, but as a descriptor for this particular psychological organization. The loop operates in a very specific sequence. Someone has a need to have one or might have one if you do not act now. The distinction between these three does not matter to the mechanism, which is important to understand. The loop does not require an actual need. It requires only the possibility of one. The hint, the atmospheric pressure change, the body registers it. That reading below the sternum, not fear. I said before, something older. The body reads the possibility of another's need and initiates the adjustment sequence before the mind has formed a thought. The adjustment happens. The want is put down. The attention moves outward. Music, the orientation reestablishes itself in the other person's situation. The other person's comfort, music, the other person's perceived state. And then, this is the part that maintains the loop, there is a brief relief, a stabilization. The room has been kept warm. The potential cooling has been averted. The adaptation has functioned as it was designed to function. And there is something that feels briefly like rightness. That feeling of rightness is the loop's fuel. It is not happiness. It is not even satisfaction in any full sense. It is the cessation of the anticipatory distress that preceded the action. The body experienced threat, someone might need something. The room might cool. The contract might be violated, and then the action resolved the threat. And the resolution produces the feeling, she calls that feeling love or purpose or meaning. It is relief, and she returns to it the way any organism returns to what relieves its distress. Not because she is weak, because she is alive and her nervous system is doing precisely what nervous systems do. But here is what the loop costs over time. And here I want to speak with the kind of precision that this subject usually avoids. Because imprecision here is its own form of harm. Every cycle of the loop that runs to completion without interruption deepens the groove. The behavioral pathway becomes more automatic. The threshold for triggering it lowers. What once required an obvious emotional demand now requires only a slight shift in another person's expression. What once required proximity now operates across distance through a message, a tone of voice, a particular silence on the phone. The empath does not become more sensitive over time. She becomes more sensitized. There is a difference. Sensitivity is a capacity. Sensitization is a wound site that has been touched so many times it can no longer distinguish between pressure and harm. And simultaneously, this is the part that is almost never named. Her own interior becomes progressively quieter. Not calmer, quieter in the sense of signal loss. The channel that would carry information about her own state, her own fatigue, her own desire, her own boundary, that channel degrades from disuse. Not because she suppresses the signals consciously, but because the loop never requires her to consult them. The loop's entire orientation is outward. And what is never consulted eventually stops reporting. I treated a woman, I will not describe her in any identifying way as was always my practice, who came to me in her late 40s, accomplished, sought after in her profession, surrounded by people who needed and admired her. She said to me in our third session something I have not forgotten in the decade since. She said, "I think I have become very good at everything except knowing what I think." She did not mean intellectual thought. She was clearly capable of that. She meant the layer beneath thought, the layer where preference lives, where instinct lives, where the body's own knowledge of what is wanted and what is not wanted originates and rises. She had lost access to that layer, not because it was damaged, because it had been systematically redirected for so long that she could no longer locate the origin point. She knew with exquisite precision what everyone around her was feeling. She could map it. She could anticipate it. She could calibrate herself to it in real time, automatically, without effort. She had no equivalent map of herself. This is what the loop produces over a lifetime, a person of extraordinary perceptive capacity and almost no self-perception. A person who can read every room she enters and cannot tell you when the room empties, what she herself actually wants for dinner. I'm not speaking hyperbolically. The small wants go first because they seem trivial. Then the medium ones because they conflict with something more pressing. Then the larger ones because by the time they have reached a size that might demand attention, the habit of not attending to them is so established that they surface only as a diffuse wrongness, a tiredness that sleep does not touch, a hunger that food does not address. And then something happens that the loop was not designed to process. Someone fails to respond to the adjustment, not because they are cruel, though sometimes they are, but because the loop, having run so successfully for so long, has attracted people and configurations that depend on it running, people who have, consciously or not, organized their own emotional life around the availability of someone who will always adjust, who will always read the room, who will always put her want down before it requires acknowledgement. When she begins, and the beginning is never a decision. I want to be clear about this. It is more like a structural shift, a slow geological movement that she does not control when she begins to not adjust, or to adjust more slowly, or to remain in her own position a moment longer than the loop previously permitted. The system around her destabilizes and the people in it do what systems do when they destabilize, they apply pressure to the point of change. This pressure takes many forms and it is important to name them without judgment because the people applying it are not, in most cases, acting from malice. They are acting from a very human disorientation, the disorientation of encountering a changed variable in a system they had understood as fixed. They say it with bewilderment, with hurt, with accusation, with the authentic distress of someone whose environment has shifted in ways they cannot account for. And she, because the loop is still there, because the body still takes its readings, because the reflex is still faster than the thought, she feels it. The accusation of selfishness lands exactly where it was always designed to land, in the place where the child learned that selfishness was the most dangerous thing she could be. And there is a moment, this is the moment I want you to locate, not remember a moment where the choice is presented again, not as a conscious fork in a road, as a physical pressure, adjust, return to the loop. Let the accusation of selfishness be true enough that it pulls you back or remain, not through will, not through a decision made in the bright light of insight, but through something that has become, over a long unannounced process, simply more real than the alternative. The root holds. I use that word deliberately. Not the cage implies external constraint. And what held her for so long was internal, was her own, was worn like skin. The root, because what has grown in her through the long dark years of the loop running and the interior quietening and the small signals going unheard, what has grown in her is not the tree she was shaped to be, something else has been growing underneath, in the place where the original self was not destroyed but only covered, in the place where the child's actual wanting was not erased but only driven down past the reach of the adaptation, past the reach of the loop into a stratum that the mechanism never penetrated, was always there. I want to say that clearly because it is the only thing in this lecture that carries any warmth, and even that warmth is not comfort. It is simply accurate. She was always there, not the adjusted one, not the giving one, not the one who could read every room, the other one, the one who had preferences before she learned they were dangerous, the one who wanted before she learned that wanting was the one thing she must not do openly. Music, that one did not disappear. She descended. And what is descending into the unconscious does not do what we imagine it does. It does not stay still. It does not wait quietly. It accumulates. It develops. It works. In the only way it can work, in that depth, through the body, through dreams, through the moments of inexplicable flatness that used to be explained away as tiredness or hormones or stress. Those moments were messages not from a damaged self, from a developing one. She has been developing this whole time. The dreams began changing before anything else did. Not the obvious dreams, the ones that arrive with the dramatic machinery of symbol and transformation, the ones that announce themselves as significant. Those are easier to dismiss. The mind has ways of absorbing them, filing them under categories it already understands, reducing their pressure to something manageable. I mean the quiet dreams, the ones that leave no image, only a residue, a temperature, a knowledge that persists through waking and cannot be located in anything the dream contained. She began waking with that something had been decided without her participation. Not decided against her, that is a different feeling entirely. And she knew that feeling well. This was something else, a settling as if in sleep in the stratum below the loop's reach. A configuration had finalized itself, had clicked into place the way a joint clicks when a bone returns to its correct position. She did not know what had finalized. That is important. The knowledge was not content. It was structural. Something is different now. I have worked with dreams for the entirety of my professional life. And I have learned to distrust the dreams that announce themselves loudly as much as I have learned to trust the ones that leave only a residue. The loud ones are often the psyche performing for the conscious mind, showing it what it already suspects in a language it can almost understand. The quiet ones, the residue dreams, are doing something else. They are not communicating to the conscious mind. They are completing a process that does not require the conscious mind's participation. This is what the unconscious does when it is ready. It does not announce. It concludes. And in the weeks or months before the empath's loop finally breaks, and by breaks I do not mean fails, I mean completes. I mean finishes the work it was always secretly doing beneath its own surface in that period. The residue dreams intensify. Not in content but in frequency, in the density of the residue left behind. She wakes. She does not know what she dreamed. She knows something is different. She goes about her day. The loop still runs. She still reads the room. She still adjusts. Still attends. Still puts the want down before it surfaces. But there is something new in the doing of it. A very slight, almost imperceptible doubling, as if she's both performing the adjustment and from a distance that has no physical location, watching herself perform it. That doubling is the developing self beginning to have enough mass to observe. She does not know what to do with it. There is no framework given to her for this experience. The culture she was raised in, the family, the relational configurations, the whole edifice of expectation that shaped the loop, that culture provided extensive instruction on how to give, how to sense, how to adjust, how to be present to another person's need with a quality of attention that feels almost sacred. It provided nothing on how to watch yourself give and know that the giving is not entirely yours. So she holds the doubling alongside the loop. She continues. She gives and watches herself give. She adjusts and watches herself adjust. She tends and watches herself tend. And in the watching there is something that is not yet language but is moving toward it. The way a shape moves toward visibility in developing photographs, that technology, I always found a useful analogy for the unconscious process. The image already present in the chemical surface, waiting only for the right conditions to emerge. What is emerging is the question she has never been permitted to ask. Not what do they need but what do I want? And I want to be careful here about what that question actually contains, because it is almost always misunderstood in both directions. From one direction, the people who surrounded her and depended on her loop will hear that question as selfishness confirmed, as the thing they always feared she might become, as evidence that the warmth is being withdrawn, that the contract is being violated, that she has become cold. From the other direction, the frameworks of recovery and healing that are available to her, the self-help, the therapeutic models oriented toward empowerment, will hear that question as the beginning of liberation, will want to rush toward it, will want to hand her tools and affirmations and a program by which the want can be recovered and expressed, music, and finally honored. Both misread what the question actually is. The question is not selfish. And the question is not the beginning of liberation. The question is anatomical. It is a person discovering that she has an interior she has never mapped. Not because the interior did not exist, it existed, descended, accumulated, music, developed. But because the behavioral apparatus she inhabited directed all of its instruments outward. And the interior was never surveyed. She is not asking what she wants because she has decided to be selfish. She is asking because she has realized in the slow geological way that realizations of this depth occur, that she does not know, that the not knowing has been the condition of her entire relational life, that every room she has entered she entered without a self-location, only another location, only the precision instruments tuned to what the room required. Now the instruments are turning, slowly, reluctantly, even because turning them inward produces at first not clarity, but a disorienting static. The channel that would carry her own signal has been silent for so long that when it begins to transmit, the transmission is not clean. Music, it is fragmentary. It arrives as irritation before it arrives as preference, as a sudden inexplicable refusal before it arrives as a considered boundary, as a flatness, an absence of the usual responsiveness before it arrives as the knowledge of what she actually feels. I want to speak about the irritation specifically because it is almost always misidentified. When the developing self begins to have enough mass to resist not dramatically, not through confrontation, but simply through the friction of its own presence, the first thing she feels is not righteous anger, not clarity, not the clean satisfaction of finally knowing where she stands. She feels irritated, a low-grade pervasive irritation that she cannot source and cannot justify, and that frightens her precisely because she cannot justify it. She is not being harmed in any obvious way. The people around her are not, in most cases, doing anything dramatically different from what they have always done. What has changed is not their behavior, but her capacity to absorb it without friction. She used to absorb without friction. The loop was specifically designed to eliminate friction, her resistance, her push against the current of another person's need. That elimination was the adaptation's central achievement. Now there is friction, and it surfaces as irritation before it surfaces as anything she can name or use or stand behind. This is where the shadow enters the analysis. And I will not soften this because the shadow in this configuration has been waiting for a very long time. The shadow, and I mean this in the precise sense in which I have always used the term, the repository of what the psyche cannot permit itself to consciously hold. The shadow of the empath is not, as is sometimes assumed, cruelty or indifference or the desire to harm. These are the shadows of a different configuration. The shadow of the empath is anger. Not the performed anger of someone who has been pushed past a threshold and is expressing it dramatically. That anger is still organized around the other person, still oriented toward their reaction, still shaped by what will be acceptable, still managed. The real anger, the unperformed one, the anger that has been accumulating in the descended self since the first time the child learned that her wanting was dangerous. Since the first time the room cooled because she had a preference. Since the first time she felt the mechanism engage and put the want down and produced the correct response and felt the relief of the room warming again and understood without being told what the transaction had cost. She was not permitted to feel that anger then. The anger would have disrupted the adaptation, would have violated the contract, would have produced exactly the consequence the adaptation existed to prevent. So it went into the shadow. Not suppressed. I want to be precise. Not suppressed in the sense of a conscious decision to push something down. Relegated. Assigned to a part of the psyche that does not participate in the conscious performance of the self. Where it remained. where it continued to accumulate with every subsequent cycle of the loop. Every adjustment that cost something unnamed. Every want put down before it surfaced. Every accommodation that was called generosity by everyone including herself. The shadow's anger is not proportionate to any single event. That is why it frightens her when it begins to emerge. It is proportionate to a lifetime. And a lifetime's worth of anger surfacing through a psyche that was organized specifically to prevent anger from surfacing. Does not arrive as a clean and righteous statement. It arrives as irritation, as flatness, as a sudden inability to produce the warmth the room has come to expect, as a slight but unmistakable delay in the adjustment sequence that the people around her feel before they can name what they are feeling. They name it as coldness. They are not wrong about the phenomenon. They are wrong about its meaning. What they are encountering is not the withdrawal of love. It is the presence of something that was never permitted to be present before. The shadow is not the opposite of love. The shadow is the part of her that love, as she was taught to perform it, required her to sacrifice. And when the shadow begins to surface, and it will surface because the psyche does not permit permanent suppression, only temporary containment, and the containment has reached its structural limit when it surfaces. It does not destroy the self. It completes it. This is the psychological event. The title of this lecture is Naming, and I want to stay with it for a moment before I move to what it produces. The child who was never allowed to be selfish developed a self that was organized around that prohibition, around the absolute imperative of the other's need, around the loop that made her sensitivity into a service and her perception into an instrument of adjustment rather than an instrument of self-knowledge. That organized self was real. I do not want to suggest it was false or performed or a mask in the shallow sense. It was a genuine psychological structure, built from genuine material, functioning with genuine competence for a genuine purpose. But it was not complete. It was missing. The half of her went into the shadow when the adaptation required it. The wanting half. The preferring half. The half that could be angry without collapsing. The half that could disappoint without dissolving. Music, the half that could say in the body, not in words, in the simple biological fact of remaining in its own position, no. Not because no is the right answer, but because she has an answer. Because she is the kind of being that has answers. And the answers are her own. And they do not require justification in the currency of another person's comfort. The integration of the shadow is not a dramatic event. I have said this before in other contexts, and I will say it here because this is where it matters most. It does not feel like becoming whole. It feels like becoming strange. Strange to herself. First, because the self that is integrating the shadow is not the same configuration that existed before. And the new configuration has no precedent in her experience. Music, strange to others because the woman who always adjusted is now without announcement, without explanation, without apology, not always adjusting. And the absence of the adjustment is felt as a presence. Something is there that was not there before. The open hand begins to close. Not into a fist. Into a hand. A hand that can open or close. That has the full range of its own motion. That is no longer fixed in the gesture of offering. That is what integration looks like from the outside. A hand that closes sometimes. A woman who sometimes does not read the room. Who sometimes remains in her own position when the pressure to adjust arrives. And who does not experience the remaining as guilt. Not yet, not entirely. The guilt is still there. The guilt was also trained into the body. But who experiences something underneath the guilt? Something that is simply quietly structural. Snorts, a root that holds. The threshold is crossed not when she decides to cross it. The threshold is crossed when she realizes she is already on the other side. What remains after the loop breaks is not what she expected. She expected relief. She had heard relief described by the frameworks available to her. By the language of recovery and awakening that surrounds these subjects as the natural outcome of this kind of completion. The weight lifts. The self returns. The life that was always hers becomes available. She does not feel relief. She feels the particular quality of silence that follows a very long sound. Not peace. Not emptiness. The acoustic aftermath of something that has been running continuously for so long that its cessation is itself a kind of presence. The loop has stopped not all at once. never all at once, but in the way that seasons stop. Which is to say, you cannot locate the exact moment of ending. Only find yourself one morning unambiguously in what comes after. And what comes after is not fullness. It is a strange, clear, cold spaciousness. I want to describe this carefully because it is the part that is most consistently misread. By her. By the people around her. By the frameworks that were designed to name what happens to people like her. The spaciousness is read as loss. As grief. Sometimes as depression. She will sit in it and wonder if something has gone wrong. Because the only reference points she has for this internal state are the emotional categories she learned in the context of the loop. And the loop did not include a category for this. The loop was organized entirely around fullness. Around the presence of another's need. Which gave her orientation. Which gave her the reading below the sternum. Which gave her the adjustment sequence. Which gave her the brief relief. Which gave her the sense of having been useful. Which gave her, and this is the word that arrives now with a weight. She was not anticipating the sense of having existed. The loop told her she existed. The sensing and the adjusting and the giving told her there was a someone here doing the sensing and adjusting and giving. Without the loop, the evidence is quieter. She has to learn to locate herself through a different instrument. And the instrument has been dormant so long that its first transmissions are weak. Fragmentary data preference that surfaces and is allowed to surface and simply exists for a moment without being put down. And she does not know what to do with it. It does not trigger the loop. It does not require action on behalf of another. It is simply hers. And it sits in the spaciousness. And she looks at it the way you look at an object found in a room you thought you knew completely. That object was always there. She begins to notice the quality of her own presence in rooms differently now. Not the temperature of the room, she still reads that. She will always read that. The instrument does not disappear, but something else. A secondary reading she was never attending to before because the primary reading consumed all available resources. She reads herself in the room. She notices when she is tired in a way that is information rather than an obstacle to be managed. She notices when she does not want to be where she is, not as guilt. Not as a problem to be solved by adjustment, as a simple fact about her own state. She notices when she is interested. When she is not, when the conversation she is in is feeding something in her, and when it is only feeding the loop. The loop does not disappear. I want to be clear about this because the expectation of its disappearance is one of the ways she will be disappointed and may misread the disappointment as failure. Music. The behavioral pathways laid down in childhood do not dissolve when the psychological structure that required them begins to change. They remain. They will always remain. In some form. As the deepest grooves in the stone. What changes is not the groove. What changes is whether she falls into it. She can feel the pull now. That is the difference. Before integration. The loop ran below the threshold of perception. It was simply what happened. Was simply what she did. Was simply who she was. Now she can feel it initiating. Can feel the reading begin. The adjustment sequence start to engage. The want begin to descend. And in the space between the initiation and the action, something exists that did not exist before. A pause, not a decision. Not a conscious deliberation. A pause in which the developing self is present enough to be consulted. In which the question not asked in language. Asked. In the body, the question of whether this adjustment is hers to make. Arises and has a moment to be heard before the action occurs. Sometimes the action occurs anyway. The groove is deep. The reflex is old. The cost of breaking the sequence in certain configurations is still. In the body. Registered as the ancient threat. The cooling. The withdrawal. The look. And the body still flinches from that threat even when the mind understands that the threat is 30 years old and its original source is no longer present. She adjusts anyway sometimes. She gives anyway. She reads the room and manages the temperature and produces the correct response and feels. Afterward. The residue that is different from the old relief. Not guilt exactly. Something more like awareness. A noticing. She did the thing. She knows she did the thing. The knowing does not punish her, that is important, but it also does not dissolve. She is building. Slowly and without a blueprint. A relationship to her own actions that is categorically different from anything the loop permitted. The loop required unconsciousness, required the action to feel inevitable, natural, chosen even though it was none of these things. What she is building now requires the opposite, requires that the action be seen, not judged. See, this is what I have always meant by consciousness in the psychological sense. Not awareness as a spiritual achievement, awareness as a structural condition. The capacity to see what you are doing while you are doing it, without the seeing collapsing the doing. Music, and without the doing, obscuring the seeing. It is the hardest thing the psyche attempts. It requires holding two positions simultaneously. The one who acts and the one who observes the acting without either position consuming the other. The empath has spent her life with only one position available. The acting position. The adjusting position. The one who is always already in motion toward the other person's need. The observer was in the shadow. Now the observer is here. Sitting in the spaciousness. Watching the hand that sometimes opens and sometimes does not. Watching the groove and watching the pause above the groove. Watching the room and watching the watcher of the room. There is a second dream I want to name here. Also encountered in the pattern I am describing. Also appearing in the period of integration. Also belonging to the category of residue dreams. The ones that leave temperature rather than image. She dreams of a door. Not a door she is trying to open. Not a door she is locked behind. A door she has already passed through. Some time ago. In a direction she cannot determine from the dream inward or outward. Deeper or further, but through which she has passed. And which is now behind her. And which is closed. She does not have the handle. She wakes not with distress, but with the knowledge that the door being closed is not the loss she would have named it a year ago. A year ago. The closed door would have meant something withheld from her. Something she was still trying to reach or return to. Now it means something else. Now the closed door is simply the shape of what she has moved past. Not a wall. A threshold. Cross. The door closes behind you when you have gone through. That is what doors do. Music, that is what they are for. And here the symbol completes its work across this lecture, not the open hand. Not the root alone but the threshold. Because the threshold is the only symbol that contains both what was left and what was entered. The only symbol that requires the crossing to make it what it is. A door that has not been walked through is only a wall with pretensions. The threshold becomes a threshold in the act of being crossed. She has crossed it, the door is closed behind her. Now I want to speak about what this completion cost the people who relied on the loop. Because I have spoken about her for 3 parts of this lecture and have not fully named what happens to the system she was embedded in. And that naming matters. Not as accusation. Not as blame. But as the completion of the psychological picture. The people who organized their emotional life around her loop did not do so out of cruelty. I want to hold this position even as I name what they did. Because the position is accurate and because collapsing into blame is another form of not seeing. They organized around her loop because it was available. Because it ran reliably. Because she had made herself into the kind of presence that could be depended upon to adjust. To read. To give. To hold configurations together at personal cost that was never named because she did not name it. And so it did not exist. Officially. As cost. They took what was offered. People take what is offered. This is not evil. This is the ordinary. Mostly. Unconscious transaction of human relationship. But when the offering changes, when the hand that was always open is now only sometimes open, and the orientation that was always outward is now sometimes inward. But because the specific form of access that required her not to be fully present to herself, that form is structurally unavailable, the root holds. She is in the ground. She does not move when pulled. And what does not move when pulled is experienced by those doing the pulling as immovable, as stone, as cold, as absence, as the betrayal of an implicit contract that they may not have known they were holding but that they held nonetheless. And that they feel the breaking of as loss. She will feel their loss. That instrument is still functioning. She will read it clearly. She will know with her usual precision exactly what her non-adjustment cost them. And the guilt will come. Not the old guilt. Not the guilt that immediately triggered the loop. but a newer, stranger guilt that she can hold in her hands and examine and set down without it pulling her back into the sequence. She can feel it and remain. This is not callousness. This is the difference between being moved and being swept away, between being present to another person's pain and organizing your entire psychic structure around its relief. She has learned, is learning, music, will continue learning to be moved without being relocated, to feel the pull and remain in her own ground. The open hand has become a hand. The root holds not because she has become hard, because she has become real. And what is real has weight, has location, cannot be blown from its position by the atmospheric pressure of another's need. However legitimate, however felt, however genuine, she is here. She is specifically, music, irrevocably here. And what is specifically irrevocably here cannot be everywhere else simultaneously. Cannot be inside every room reading every temperature. Cannot be the thermal regulator for configurations that have their own capacity for warmth if they are required to generate it rather than extract it. Music, this is what the child who was never allowed to be selfish grows into when she grows at all the way the descended self requires. Not a person who has learned to take. Not a person who has learned to refuse. Not a person who has traded one organization of the self for another equally rigid. A person who has a self, who knows it is there, who can consult it, who gives from it when giving arises from that ground, and it does arise. It is not gone. The capacity for genuine care does not dissolve with the loop. It deepens. Because care that does not cost the self is a different order of thing entirely. And who remains in it when the pull arrives and the groove beckons and the old reflex initiates and the body still after all this time still recognizes the shape of the threat. She remains not through will, not through decision, through the simple cold, completed fact of what she now is. The child who was never allowed to be selfish did not grow up to become selfish. She grew up to become present. And presence, when it finally arrives in a person who was organized from infancy around its absence, is the most dangerous, most irreducible, most quietly devastating thing she has ever been. She is not sorry.